Hi, everybody. Why don't we start? First of all, thanks for coming. I appreciate you coming to this talk. I know there's so many to choose from. I'm Wade Roush. I am the host and producer of Soonish. And what I'm going to do today is give you a preview of an episode that is a work in progress. It hasn't come out yet. With a little bit of luck, I will be releasing it next week sometime. It's still in rough draft form. It doesn't have a lot of sound design or music underneath it yet, just a little bit. But the story is there. The bones of the story are there. And I invite you to come back and listen to the finished version and figure out what changed. So there are a couple handouts. I put some handouts on the chairs there, and those are sort of audiovisual guides. I wasn't sure if the slides would be working, so I made some printouts, some old-fashioned paper printouts as well, that will help you understand this story. Because there is a thing in this story that everyone should see. And one of the problems with podcasts is it's hard to get people to go and look at the thing that they're supposed to go look at. So, so I made a printout in this case. Okay, I am going to basically perform this episode. And it'll last about 22 minutes, I think. And hopefully at the end there will be time for conversation, if we're so inclined. So here we go.
The future is shaped by technology, but technology is shaped by us.
You're listening to Soonish. I'm Wade Roush. And most of the time, what we do here on the show is look at the near future. Personally, I think the most powerful factor shaping that future is technology. It's the one big force that makes the present feel different from the past. And it's the force that'll make the future feel different from the present. But that force isn't impersonal. It doesn't come from outside society. It comes from us. We all make choices every day about which technologies we want in our lives. That's the meaning of the motto you heard at the top of the show. But just because we have choices about technology doesn't mean that we always choose well. And today, instead of taking you into the near future, I want to go the other way, into the near past. I'm going to drag up a bit of history from my hometown of Boston that turns out to be a perfect case study in bad decision-making about the future. It's a story that's almost completely unknown, even to people who live in Boston. Heck, I didn't even know about it myself until I was out walking in my neighborhood one day, a couple of years ago, and I stumbled across an obscure plaque in East Cambridge that had been put up by the Cambridge Historical Commission 40 years earlier.
Always read the plaque.
I was astonished to learn when I read this plaque that my hometown of Cambridge, Massachusetts,
Our fair city,
was home to one of the world's first monorail systems. The experimental test track for this monorail was in place from 1884 to 1894, and it was intended as the prototype for a regional rapid transit system that would have made Boston into a kind of steampunk utopia. The city would have been crisscrossed by these marvelous tubular trains that looked like they were designed by Captain Nemo, which I think would have been amazing. But of course I would say that because I'm a major monorail fanboy. You know how Roman Mars, over at 99% Invisible, says every city deserves a well-designed flag? Well, I think every city deserves a well-designed monorail. The fact is, when you compare monorails to other mass transit technologies like subways or light rail, monorails stand above the crowd, so to speak. They are faster, safer, cheaper, and just cooler. To hear why, you can go back and listen to Soonish Season 1, Episode 2, or you can just trust me. The point is that we never got that awesome steampunk version of Boston, because in 1887, this monorail got abruptly derailed. And the story of the track not taken is what I'm going to tell you about today. That story started right here. I'm standing next to a busy 6-lane boulevard in East Cambridge called Monsignor O'Brien Highway. To be specific, I'm at 225 Monsignor O'Brien Highway. The building at this address today is a big 4-story factory owned by the Superior Nut Company. Inside, they roast almonds and cashews. And on a breezy day, I can smell a truly luscious aroma from my own apartment half a mile away. But back in the 1880s, before this neighborhood went nuts, this was called Bridge Street. It crossed a tidal marsh called Miller's River, which at that point was gradually being filled in to make new land. And if you've been standing here at 225 Bridge Street in 1884, you would have been looking at the headquarters for the Meigs Elevated Railway Company. This is where an inventor and Civil War veteran from Tennessee named Josiah Vincent Meigs built the demonstration track for his patented monorail system. There was a shed here that sheltered a steam locomotive, a tender, and a passenger car, all built using Meigs' unusual tubular design and tilted wheels. There was a single iron track that exited the shed, turned left in a tight half circle, and went back past the shed. The track went along at ground level for about 300 feet, and then it climbed up to a section built on posts 14 feet above the ground. This elevated section curved again to the left and crossed over Bridge Street, leaving room below for traffic and horse-drawn streetcars. The track stopped on the other side of Bridge Street, over what's now a parking lot for a Holiday Inn. Between 1884 and 1894, thousands of riders were whisked back and forth on Meigs' test track at up to 20 miles per hour. And the reason I can sort of visualize all this today is that Meigs included copious diagrams and maps in a book he published in 1887. This book was called The Meigs Railway, The Reasons for Its Departure from Ordinary Practice and How and Why a Safe Railway is Possible.
The track was built so as to test every kind of ways to its quality, strength, curves, grades, post settings, and the safety of its form and material. Every engineering difficulty which could possibly occur in any situation was put into the track and successfully overcome.
That's Joe Meigs in his own words, voiced for us by audio producer Charles Gusty from Soonish's sister Hub and Spoke podcast, Iconography.
The location purposely selected for the experiment of setting the foundation for the tracks was the worst to be found, the entire surface being made land by filling the refuse of the city, dumped upon the dark mud, silt, and wash of Miller's River, covered in by order of the Board of Health. If a post-supported railway could be built here without inordinate cost, it could be built anywhere in Boston, or even about its marshy suburbs.
When Meigs wrote anywhere in Boston, he really meant it, because he had what you might call a one-track mind. He looked at the streets of 1880s Boston and saw a chaotic tangle of horse-drawn carriages, horse-drawn streetcars, and pedestrians. And he wanted to fix it.
So all of these horse-drawn streetcars funneled into Boston in a hub-and-spoke system and created a great deal of congestion. So the first thought in the Boston area was that they needed to build elevators.
That's Charlie Sullivan. Since 1975, he's been the executive director of the Cambridge Historical Commission. He's the only historian I could find who knows anything about the Meigs Monorail system. In fact, he's the guy who wrote that plaque that I stumbled across. Now, Charlie says that when Meigs looked at Boston's congested downtown, he imagined a network of steam-powered trains sailing overhead, 15 or 20 feet above the street. He knew that railway companies in New York were already building elevated lines in Manhattan, but the idea there was to put standard dual-track railways up on stilts, where they threw smoke and cinders and shadows over the streets below. If you've ever visited New York's High Line, take that, and then imagine miles of those elevated tracks running all over Lower Manhattan. Meigs knew that he didn't want Boston's system to look anything like that.
Meigs came along in the early 1880s, developed his concept of a monorail that would be a single track or a track on a single line of posts that would run down the center of the street. He probably looked at the New York elevated technology and said, "This is really dumb. You know, we could make it a lot simpler and have the same good result."
The heart of Meigs' idea was to build an elevated railway with a slimmer profile, so that it wouldn't interfere with what he repeatedly called light and air.
By the advice of counsel, I called together many persons interested in street railways and sought their alliance. They agreed that my models offered the best plan, with the least obstruction of light and air, with the greatest capability for turning crooked streets, and for this reason, the only solution of the difficulties of street railway traffic suitable to Boston. We have built our way at East Cambridge within 8 feet of the windows of a frame dwelling, and it was declared by the woman living in the house that during the passage of our train at all speeds, she was less disturbed by the passage of our engine than by the horse cars in the street. It is self-evident to anybody who inspects it that light and air are not at all interfered with. Everybody who knows anything of the history of elevated trains in New York knows exactly the contrary to be the case.
Everybody likes light and air, right? Well, it turns out that even before Meigs built his test track, the people of Boston fell in love with his idea.
The people want elevated roads. We sent out many thousand circulars, attempting to instruct the people of the city as to my invention and its effects upon property. The result was that 64,000 citizens of Boston signed petitions in favor of permitting me to try my system.
In the 1880s, the population of Boston was only about 360,000, which means that if Meigs was telling the truth, more than 1 in 6 residents signed his petition. But one of the strange things about this whole story is that nobody really knows much about Joe Meigs, the man, or where he got his monorail idea.
Yeah, well, Joe Meigs is still pretty much a mystery. He comes out of Tennessee, born in the 1840s, served in the Civil War, had been a railroad mechanic, ended up in Boston in the 1870s, and had this concept for urban mass transit.
We do know that Meigs grew up in Nashville and worked as an apprentice engineer on the Memphis and Charlestown Railroad. When the Civil War came, he joined the Union Army and led a light artillery division. But an injury forced him to resign, and he spent the rest of the war developing his skills as a tinkerer. After the war, Meigs became a kind of protege to Benjamin Butler. Butler was sort of the Donald Trump of his day. He was a former Union general and Massachusetts congressman. He owned cotton mills and cartridge factories in Lowell, Massachusetts. But his family also made an illicit fortune selling goods to the Confederacy during the war. Meigs met Butler in Washington, D.C., and after the war, he moved to Lowell to run one of Butler's factories. Butler was a big supporter of Meigs' monorail idea, probably because he saw money in it. And after Butler became governor of Massachusetts in 1883, he helped Meigs get a charter to build the elevated railway in downtown Boston. The charter basically gave Meigs the right to use the airspace above Boston streets for his monorail tracks. But there was one little problem. The streetcar industry absolutely hated Meigs' plan, and the reason was pretty predictable. If Bostonians had a convenient way to travel above the streets, they'd stop paying to ride the horse-drawn cars on the streets. So, lobbyists for the streetcar companies forced the state legislature to put a minor condition into the charter. Before Meigs could get his final permission to build the railway, he'd have to prove the concept by building a working prototype. So that's what he did, using money borrowed from Butler and land in East Cambridge borrowed from a local meatpacker.
The track was a loop that included some steep grades and tight curves, and basically proved his concept. It showed that he had a highly workable concept for a monorail that would have been steam powered, but would have been probably less intrusive than the Manhattan locomotive hauled elevated trains.
We have tried all we could to break down our track and disable our engine, for if it could be done, it was to be done in an experimental yard. It is but fair to say that since we made the tests, we have carried many thousand passengers over these grades, angles, and curves, which in a properly constructed road would never occur. Yet the motion of the train was so regular, easy, and noiseless that the passengers did not know or suspect what sort of road they were riding over.
Now, this is where I gotta take a minute to talk about Meigs' actual design, and why it was so different from the other elevated railways being built at the time. The track itself was a simple iron girder, a few feet high, with a flange at the bottom. Each truck on Meigs' monorail cars had 4 wheels, 2 drive wheels and 2 support wheels. The drive wheels were mounted horizontally. Under hydraulic pressure, they'd be brought together until they squeezed the central girder hard enough to pull the train forward. The support wheels were mounted at a kind of 45-degree angle to the girder, forming a V shape that rested on the flange and gripped the rail like a clenched fist. The key thing to understand about the wheel design was that it was more stable under unbalanced loads. If a strong wind came along, or if there was ever an accident, the cars basically couldn't derail. The train could not fall off the track. Also, because of the way the wheels pivoted, the Meigs Monorail had an extremely tight turning radius. That meant the track could be built to go around the crooked corners of downtown Boston. But all that stuff with the wheels was going on underneath the train. To a bystander in 1884, the most striking thing about the design would have been the cars themselves. If you took a conventional train car and sliced through it, the cross-section would be a square. Not Meigs's train. His cars were round, almost like they were designed to whoosh through a pneumatic tube.
Well, I mean, these trains do look odd because they're cylindrical. They look like sausages riding along a elevated track. Think of a Wienermobile riding on a stick. That seems to have been a 1880s version of streamlining. They don't look like conventional railroad cars. They look like something quite futuristic. They look like Jules Verne could have sketched this for one of his novels.
And that Wienermobile design wasn't just for looks. Meigs argued in his book that giving the cars a cylindrical shape made them stronger, required less material, and cut down on wind resistance. And what really mattered was that Meigs' system just worked. The design may have looked a little crazy, but 3 years of testing gave Meigs time to overcome every possible technical objection.
It was very practical. It was very well engineered, well thought out. The system was operated for a number of years, moved large numbers of people on demonstration rides, and it seemed to be entirely practical.
So at this point, in a perfect world, the Massachusetts legislature would have told Meigs, hey, cool invention. You've clearly met the testing requirements in the charter. Now, go build your monorail all over Boston. But that's not what happened. By 1887, Meigs was more of a threat to the streetcar lobby than ever before.
So I think it's a war between two different means of moving people. You had a street railway system by the 1880s that was highly developed and was moving a lot of people and was making a lot of money for its investors. So any kind of elevated system or subway system, any other kind of competing technology would have been opposed by them simply because it was disruptive and destructive to their investment.
And in the winter of 1887, streetcar operators decided to do something drastic to protect their investment. If you turn to the very last page of Meigs' book, you'll find this sad postscript.
At 4 a.m. on the morning of February 4th, 1887, an incendiary fire burned the greater part of the shed containing my engine, tender, and car. But for the police and fire departments, my whole train would have been destroyed by the intensity of the fire built around it. As it was, the most magnificent car ever built was melted down by the furnace into which it was thrust. Its metal plates were melted down, the little wooden upholstery burned out.
The blaze destroyed Meigs' train shed at 225 Bridge Street, as well as his beautiful cylindrical passenger car. No criminal charges were ever filed, but it was pretty clear what had happened.
Foul play was suspected. There was just a lot of hostility to this that never abated. I think street railwaymen saw this as a huge threat. They employed thousands of men and horses, all of whom could see their jobs changing or being threatened by something like this. And so it wouldn't take too much to generate that kind of hostility. There were a number of street railway strikes in the 1880s. It was a volatile time in the industry. And it's certainly conceivable that kind of hostility resulted in arson here.
Now, Meigs was a pretty stubborn guy, and this wasn't his first experience with vandals. So his defiant tone after the fire was totally in character.
This is the last of a series of attempts of a like nature to hinder my progress. First, out of malice, My models were mutilated and broken at the State House. Then the building, number 89 Court Street, where my lecture room models were placed, was set on fire. They have mutilated the car at Miss Cambridge by cutting and other petty annoyances. These criminal acts are merely futile and grieving, but do not hinder the enterprise in the least.
But the truth is that after the fire, the Meigs Elevated Railway Company never really bounced back. Benjamin Butler left the governor's office in 1884, and Meigs's battle with the state legislature dragged on for years. He didn't get final approval to start building his monorail system until 1894. But by then, he had several new problems. In 1888, a storm, later dubbed the Snow Hurricane, dumped 5 feet of snow on Boston and paralyzed the city for weeks, which strengthened the argument that if Boston was going to invest in a new rapid transit system, it should probably be built underground. On top of that, Meigs was utterly convinced that his locomotives should run on coal and steam at a time when most new transit systems were switching over to electricity. That scared off most of his investors, and in the end, Meigs's stubbornness would basically cost him everything. By 1896, he was out of money. All he really had left was the charter rights to the airspace above Boston streets, which he decided to sell to his remaining investors. And ironically, that sale led directly to the creation of the conventional dual-track subway and elevated system that still carries Bostonians today.
The investors went back to the legislature for permission to build a conventional elevated system in Boston and prevailed. The company was bought out by J.P. Morgan eventually and built the rapid transit system that we have in Boston today. And so all of the mass transit in Greater Boston came under one roof. Boston Elevated Railway operated until 1947, I think, and then became the Metropolitan Transit Authority. It was acquired by the state. It's now the MBTA.
I asked Charlie Sullivan if he ever allowed himself to imagine how Boston might look today if Meigs's competitors hadn't torched his beautiful monorail.
Well, almost all of our elevated lines are gone now, and these probably would have disappeared too, replaced by subways or relocated to active rail lines. But it's interesting to think that something as light as this might have hung on longer, long enough to be upgraded and modernized into a 20th century technology.
In other words, maybe there's a parallel universe where today's MBTA still uses a single-track system. Maybe parts of that system are above ground. Maybe others are at grade or below ground. Maybe it has all the advantages that Meigs touted, with tracks that are easier and cheaper to build, and trains that run faster and more safely. Not to mention all that light and air. But that's not the universe we live in. In our universe, financiers from New York City gave us the MBTA, with a helping hand from the streetcar lobby's arsonists. Speaking as a monorail believer, I'd argue that our 19th century forebears not only made the wrong choice, but they made it in the wrong way. If streetcar operators had given Meigs a chance to compete for customers in a fair and open market, his system might have prevailed. But they weren't willing to risk it. So instead, they resorted to legal legerdemain and violence. And let's face it, that's how we roll here in America. In the 1940s, 50 years after the Meigs system failed, the shoe was on the other foot, when automotive and petroleum interests bought up dozens of streetcar companies around the US, then proceeded to rip out the rails and convert them into bus lines. So look, we humans always have the power to choose which future we want to live in. That's what Soonish is all about. But we don't always have a great process for choosing. So the decisions we make can be messy, undemocratic, profit-driven, and sometimes downright corrupt. The best plan with the least obstruction to light and air isn't always the winner. Sometimes the best plan just ends up as some words on a plaque. Thank you. It's 2:30, and I think there's another session here at 2:45, right? Yeah, but I'm in charge of the camera, so. Okay. We can talk if you want, and they'll kick us out in a few minutes. But anybody have any questions, reactions, feedback? Yeah, Doug. That's not how you normally record, is it? You mean like all in one take? Yeah. Absolutely not. You know, you're making me think though that maybe it would be worth trying that. You know, usually I record one line at a time and then I string it back all together. I usually do one sentence at a time and repeat that sentence over and over until I get a take that I was happy with. But what happens is that the tone and emphasis and volume are not always the same from line to line, and I probably wind up losing a sort of continuity that I might have. Yeah, exactly.
There's also that wonderful adrenaline you get in live performance.
Yeah, totally.
And you gotta do it right or else.
Yeah, right. It's like Dan Carlin was saying about radio, right? Yeah.
Improvisation, and you don't recognize over, what did he say? In a 5-hour take, a little tick in your voice doesn't really matter.
Right. Yeah. Chris.
Curious how you refined your script to decide where you jumped from story about a person in a situation to like background elements, and what that looks like in a story like this, what your process is. You know, like this is how the monorail actually works. You know,
Right.
You did that. You know, I think totally perfect, fairly far into it. But do you have an approach, a way that you think about that you would share?
Well, the reason I liked this story was not just because I love obscure corners of industrial history, but it had a character at the center of it, this guy Joe Meigs, and even though there isn't any actual biography of him, and all we really know about him is the book that he left behind and a few scattered details, he was enough of a character that I could kind of emphasize what a sort of, in a way, whimsical, what's the word? Kind of crazy idea this was, and hang it all on him and his character. So I basically tried to go back and forth between describing the idea and his enthusiasm for it, and pause at certain points to explain why the idea was so unusual. I want him to come across as looking a little bit like a crazy inventor, a crazy sort of like Doc Brown type. But also, I think he was right. I think this was an awesome idea, and they should have actually built it. So it's sort of on that line between a curiosity and a lost opportunity, I guess, is what I was trying to do. Yeah. Thanks. Sure, back there.
So I moved to Boston about a year ago. I lived in JP, and it's very similar thing they did on the elevator. You guys were on the line. Were there any other resources or podcasts or anything that you recommend? Specifically, transport Boston Street kind of stuff.
Are you asking about the history of transportation in Boston, or? There ought to be. That would be a great idea for a podcast, actually. Yeah. Well, there's a great reporter at the Boston Globe named Adam Vaccaro who covers the T and other transit issues around Boston, and he's extremely knowledgeable. So I would just follow him on Twitter and read everything he writes in the Globe. That's a good place to start. There's a group here in Boston that I'm not going to remember the name of it, but it's sort of a group of young Turks who are all trained in urban planning and transportation planning, and they have a sort of consultancy that regularly issues blistering reports about everything the MBTA is doing wrong. And they have to pay attention because these guys are actually experts. They know what they're talking about, and they're right most of the time. So there's a rich tradition of, as you will learn, as you probably already know, of people in Boston carping about the T. It's like, I don't know what we would do without it, because we would have one less thing to complain about. But it really is falling apart. And so there's a lot of, there's sort of a whole industry of people criticizing it. But in terms of like institutional history, archival history, I didn't dig that far into it. All I really needed for this episode was that Meigs book, which is just available free on Google Books. and talking with Charlie Sullivan, who was like a human jukebox for information about the history of Boston and Cambridge. You just like press the button, Joe Meigs, and he can talk to you for an hour. So he's like a national treasure. Anybody else? Yeah, Nick. Cool. Yeah, that's definitely a good one. We did wind up with the nation's first subway system, so we have that distinction. But now we have the nation's oldest subway system, so we have that distinction, right? Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, everybody. Oh, Doug, one more?
I just like the way you started and ended with the plaque, and the story just opened in kind of an oval and included so many other events, and then it just came back to the same spot and called to mind all the buried complexities of history all around us. It was just really well written.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I got some business stuff. Pick up one of my cards if you'd like. 13 different backs to collect.